In the heart of Washington, D.C., where power and politics collide daily, an unexpected drama unfolded that would leave both its participants and the nation reeling. It was one of those mornings when the air felt heavy with anticipation. People hurried through the corridors of the Supreme Court building, clutching briefcases, notebooks, and cups of coffee. Among them was a young journalist who had no idea her day was about to take a turn she could never have imagined. Karoline Leavitt was not your typical reporter. She wasn't flashy or overly aggressive like some of her peers. Instead, she carried herself with quiet determination, always ready to ask tough questions without raising her voice. That morning, she had arrived early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the justices as they entered the courthouse. Her goal was simple: observe, listen, and maybe snag a quote or two for her next story. Little did she know, this routine assignment would spiral into something far bigger than she ever expected. As Karoline stood near the entrance, adjusting her scarf against the chilly breeze sneaking through the doors, Judge Clarence Thomas appeared. He moved with the kind of confidence that comes from decades of experience, his robes flowing behind him like a cape. To most people, he seemed untouchable, a figure of authority whose decisions shaped lives across the country. But today, something about his demeanor felt different. His jaw was set tightly and his eyes scanned the room with an intensity that made a few bystanders instinctively step back. Karoline didn't think much of it. She adjusted her position slightly, angling herself closer to the restricted area, marked by a velvet rope. It wasn't intentional. She just wanted a better view. As Judge Thomas approached, his gaze landed on her. For a moment their eyes met, and Karoline offered a polite nod, a gesture of respect. But instead of returning it, Judge Thomas frowned. Something about her presence, or perhaps her proximity, rubbed him the wrong way. What happened next came so quickly that even Karoline struggled to process it. One moment she was standing there minding her own business. The next, security officers were closing in around her. Judge Thomas had given a sharp command, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Detain her," he said firmly, leaving no room for argument. The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Karoline froze, confusion washing over her face. "What? Why?" she stammered, raising her hands instinctively as if to show she meant no harm. But the officers didn't hesitate. They grabbed her arms gently yet firmly, pulling her aside despite her protests. "I didn't do anything wrong," she insisted, her voice rising above the growing commotion. Onlookers stopped in their tracks, craning their necks to see what was happening. Some whispered among themselves, while others pulled out their phones to capture the scene unfolding before them. The situation escalated rapidly. Within moments, photos of Karoline being escorted away began circulating online. Social media erupted, with speculation and outrage. Who was this woman? What had she done to provoke such a reaction from one of the most respected figures in American law? Hashtags like Free Karoline and Our Justice for Journalists started trending almost instantly, turning the incident into a national conversation. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Thomas retreated to his chambers, his expression unreadable. At first glance, he appeared resolute, convinced he'd done the right thing. After all, maintaining order and decorum within the court was part of his duty. But as he sat down at his desk, the weight of what had just transpired began to sink in. Had he acted too hastily? Was detaining someone over such a minor infraction truly justified? These questions swirled in his mind, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Outside, the chaos continued to grow. Reporters who had witnessed the scene scrambled to gather details, firing off tweets and updating live blogs. Lawyers and judges passing through the hallway paused to watch, their faces etched with disbelief. Even seasoned veterans of the legal world couldn't recall a time when a sitting Supreme Court justice had taken such drastic action against a member of the press. For Karoline, the minutes dragged on endlessly. She found herself in a small holding room, her mind racing as she tried to piece together how things had gone so wrong so fast. She hadn't broken any rules, at least none that she knew of. All she'd done was stand near the entrance, trying to do her job. And now here she was, caught in the middle of a firestorm she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Judge Thomas wrestled with his conscience. 9 minutes had passed since he'd ordered Karoline's detention, but it felt like an eternity. The initial satisfaction of asserting control had faded, replaced by a creeping sense of doubt. He replayed the scene in his head, analyzing every detail. Had her muttered comment about accountability really been so threatening? Or had he misinterpreted her intentions entirely? As the clock ticked on, Judge Thomas realized he had a decision to make. He could dig in his heels and defend his actions, risking further damage to his reputation, or he could admit his mistake and try to make things right. Either way, the stakes were high, not just for him, but for the institution he represented. The choice he made next would shape not only his legacy, but also the broader narrative surrounding justice, accountability, and the fragile relationship between authority and the press. Judge Thomas sat in his chambers, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy weight. The room, usually a place of calm and focus, now felt suffocating. He stared at the stack of papers on his desk, but his mind was miles away, replaying the scene over and over again. He kept thinking about Karoline, her confusion, her protests, the way she had looked at him as if he were someone unrecognizable. It wasn't just guilt gnawing at him, it was shame. For years, Judge Thomas had prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who upheld the law without wavering. But now doubt crept in. Had he let his emotions get the better of him? Was this really about maintaining order, or had something deeper driven his actions? He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line, not just legally, but morally. The idea that he might have abused his authority weighed heavily on him. As the minutes ticked by, the outside world continued to react. Social media buzzed with outrage. People shared videos of Karoline being led away, her voice echoing faintly in the background as she insisted she hadn't done anything wrong. Commentators debated whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of tension between the judiciary and the press. Talk shows dedicated entire segments to dissecting the situation, with guests arguing passionately on both sides. Some defended Judge Thomas, saying he was within his rights to maintain discipline in the courthouse. Others condemned him, accusing him of overreach and bullying. Back in the holding room, Karoline tried to steady her breathing. She wasn't used to being in situations like this. Most days, her work involved typing up articles or interviewing sources, not sitting in a cold, sterile room wondering what would happen next. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her notebook, the only familiar thing she had with her. She flipped through its pages absent-mindedly, reading notes from past assignments. Each word reminded her why she did what she did: to tell stories, to hold people accountable, to give a voice to those who didn't have one. But right now, none of that seemed to matter. She felt powerless, stuck in a system she didn't fully understand. Still, she refused to let fear take over. Instead, she focused on the facts. She hadn't broken any rules. She hadn't caused a disturbance. All she'd done was stand near the entrance, trying to do her job. If anything, the real issue here was how quickly things had spiraled out of control. And deep down, she knew she couldn't stay quiet about it. Outside the courthouse, the crowd grew larger. Reporters who had come for routine coverage of the day's hearings were now gathered around, microphones in hand, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. Lawyers and court staff lingered nearby, whispering among themselves. A few members of the public joined in, drawn by curiosity or concern. Someone held up a sign that read, "Protect press freedom," while another chanted softly under their breath, "Justice for all." The energy was electric, a mix of anger, frustration, and determination. For many, this wasn't just about Karoline. It was about something bigger. It was about the balance of power, the role of the press, and the responsibility of those in positions of authority. People wanted answers, and they weren't going to leave until they got them. Inside the courthouse, Judge Thomas finally made a move. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used, a trusted colleague whose judgment he respected. When the call connected, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need your advice," he said. his voice low but urgent. He explained the situation, leaving out no details. To his surprise, the person on the other end listened patiently, asking thoughtful questions instead of jumping to conclusions. "You've got a tough decision to make," the colleague said after a pause. "But remember, it's not just about you. This is about trust. People look to you for leadership. How you handle this will say a lot about who you are and what kind of justice system we have." Those words hit home. Judge Thomas realized he couldn't undo what had happened, but he could control how he responded. He thought about the countless speeches he'd given over the years about fairness and integrity. Now, more than ever, those values needed to guide him. With a deep sigh, he hung up the phone and called for his assistant. Together, they began drafting a statement, one that acknowledged his mistake and expressed regret for the way Karoline had been treated. Meanwhile, Karoline's colleagues sprang into action. Newsrooms across the country lit up with activity as editors assigned teams to cover the story. Calls poured in from reporters asking for statements, interviews, and insights. One of Karoline's closest friends at work managed to reach her via text message. "Are you okay?" the message read. "We're working on getting you out." Karoline typed back a quick reply. "I'm fine, just shaken. Thanks for having my back." Those few words meant everything to her. Knowing she wasn't alone gave her strength. She started jotting down notes in her notebook, documenting everything she could remember about the incident. Every detail mattered. The tone of Judge Thomas's voice, the expressions on the security officers' faces, the reactions of the bystanders. Someday she hoped to write about this experience, to share it with the world in a way that might spark change. By late afternoon, Judge Thomas's statement went public. In clear, straightforward language, he admitted his error. "Today I acted impulsively and unjustly," he wrote. "Ms. Leavitt did nothing to warrant detention, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Our courts exist to serve justice, not to suppress it. I regret my actions and assure everyone that steps are being taken to ensure this does not happen again." The response was immediate and varied. Some praised him for owning up to his mistake, calling it a rare moment of accountability from someone in his position. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether the apology was genuine or simply a way to save face. Either way, the statement marked a turning point. Behind the scenes, arrangements were made to release Karoline without charges. When she stepped outside the courthouse, blinking in the bright sunlight, she was greeted by applause. Dozens of people, reporters, activists, ordinary citizens had gathered to show their support. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward her, but Karoline didn't shy away. Standing tall, she addressed the crowd, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. "I didn't ask for this," she began, pausing to collect herself. "But if my experience can shine a light on the importance of protecting free speech and holding power accountable, then maybe something good can come out of it. Today isn't about me. It's about all of us. Let's use this moment to demand better, to fight for transparency, and to remind ourselves that justice belongs to everyone." Her words resonated deeply, earning cheers from the crowd. As she walked away, surrounded by colleagues and well-wishers, it was clear that this was far from over. The incident had ignited a conversation that wouldn't fade anytime soon. For Judge Thomas, it was a humbling lesson in humanity and humility. For Karoline, it was a defining moment that would shape her career, and perhaps even her legacy, for years to come. As Karoline walked away from the courthouse, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. The crowd's applause and cheers were uplifting, but they couldn't fully erase the sting of the morning's events. She felt a mix of emotions, anger at how unfairly she'd been treated, relief that it was finally over, and a strange sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her anymore. It had become something bigger. People were watching, listening, and expecting her to say something meaningful. And while part of her wanted to retreat, take a long shower, and forget the whole thing ever happened, another part knew she couldn't. She paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Some held signs, Others clutched their phones, recording every word she said. Reporters shouted questions from all directions, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. "How do you feel?" one asked. "What will you do next?" Another chimed, and Karoline took a deep breath, holding up a hand to signal she needed a moment. She didn't want to rush this. Whatever she said now would carry weight, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in the importance of a free press. "I'm still processing everything," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "This morning, I came here like any other day, just trying to do my job. I never imagined I'd end up in handcuffs or that so many people would care." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head as if to remind herself this was real. "But I think that's the point. It shouldn't take something extreme like this to make us realize how fragile our freedoms are. We can't take them for granted." Her words struck a chord with the crowd. A few people nodded in agreement while others murmured encouragement. Someone yelled, "You're an inspiration," which made Karoline smile faintly, though she didn't entirely feel like one. To her, she was just a person who had stumbled into a situation far beyond her control. But maybe that was the thing about moments like these. They found you when you least expected it, forcing you to rise to the occasion. After speaking briefly, Karoline stepped aside, allowing her colleagues to handle the media frenzy. She needed space to think, to process everything that had happened. As she walked toward a nearby park, she noticed how the afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd left behind. Sitting on a bench, she pulled out her notebook again, flipping to a blank page. Writing always helped her organize her thoughts, and right now her mind was spinning. She started jotting down ideas, not sure where they would lead. How could she turn this experience into something positive? What could she do to ensure that no one else went through what she had today? Her pen moved quickly across the page, filling it with scribbles and half-formed sentences. She wrote about accountability, transparency, and the need for reforms and how authority figures interacted with the public. She even sketched out a rough plan for a series of articles exploring these issues in depth. While Karoline worked through her thoughts, Judge Thomas remained in his chambers, grappling with his own emotions. The apology he'd issued earlier felt like a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. He knew actions spoke louder than words, and he needed to prove that he meant what he said. Pacing back and forth, he considered his options. Should he hold a press conference, write an op-ed, reach out directly to Karoline? Each idea came with its own risks and rewards, but doing nothing wasn't an option. Finally, he settled on a plan. He called a trusted aide and instructed them to arrange a meeting with leaders from journalism organizations. He wanted to hear their concerns firsthand, to understand how the courts could better support the work of reporters without compromising security or decorum. It was a bold move, one that might open him up to criticism, but he believed it was necessary. If he truly wanted to rebuild trust, he had to start by listening. The aide hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by the request. "Are you sure about this?" they asked cautiously. Judge Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "Yes," he replied firmly. "This isn't about me or my reputation. It's about making sure we learn from this and do better moving forward." Word of the planned meeting spread quickly, drawing mixed reactions. Some praised Judge Thomas for taking proactive steps, while others dismissed it as a PR stunt. Either way, it kept the conversation alive, ensuring that the incident wouldn't fade into obscurity. For Judge Thomas, that was exactly the point. He didn't want people to forget, not because he enjoyed the attention, but because forgetting meant risking a repeat of the same mistakes. Back at the park, Karoline closed her notebook and leaned back on the bench, letting the cool breeze wash over her. She felt drained but oddly hopeful. Despite everything, she saw an opportunity here, an opening to push for change in ways she hadn't considered before. Maybe this wasn't just a low point in her career. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, Karoline stood up and stretched. She glanced back at the courthouse, its towering columns silhouetted against the fading light. For all its flaws, it represented something important, a system designed to serve justice, however imperfectly. And if there was one thing she'd learned today, it was that systems only worked when people demanded better. With renewed determination, she headed home, ready to face whatever came next. Little did she know, the ripple effects of this day were just beginning to spread. Across the country, people were talking, not just about Karoline or Judge Thomas, but about the broader issues their encounter had exposed. From newsrooms to dinner tables, conversations sparked about power, accountability, and the delicate balance between authority and freedom. For both Karoline and Judge Thomas, this was a crossroads, a moment that would define how they moved forward. Neither of them could predict exactly where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: they had each been changed by it. And sometimes, that was the first step toward real progress. The next morning, the story dominated headlines everywhere. Newspapers splashed bold letters across their front pages. Supreme Court Justice apologizes after detaining reporter. Karoline Leavitt becomes symbol of press freedom. And a day that changed the conversation. Television anchors dissected every detail, replaying clips of Karoline's press conference and Judge Thomas's apology. Social media feeds were flooded with memes, debates, and heartfelt messages from people who saw themselves in her shoes. For better or worse, both Karoline and Judge Thomas had become central figures in a national dialogue about power, accountability, and justice. Karoline woke up to find her phone buzzing nonstop. Messages poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers, some offering support, others seeking interviews or advice on how to advocate for similar causes. At first, she felt overwhelmed. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and it was hard to separate the genuine voices from those just looking for a soundbite. But as she scrolled through the notifications, one message stood out. It was from an older journalist she deeply admired, someone known for exposing corruption and fighting for truth when no one else would. "You've got a chance to make a difference here," the message read. "Use your platform wisely. People are listening." Those words stuck with her throughout the day. They reminded her that while the spotlight could be uncomfortable, it also came with responsibility. If she wanted to see real change, she couldn't shy away now. So instead of retreating into herself, Karoline leaned in. She accepted invitations to appear on major news networks, agreeing to share her story. But only if she could use the opportunity to talk about bigger issues. She didn't want to dwell on what had happened to her personally. She wanted to focus on why it mattered. Her first interview aired live that evening, and millions tuned in to watch. The host started with the obvious question: "How are you feeling today?" Karoline smiled softly, leaning forward slightly in her chair. "Honestly, I'm still processing everything," she admitted. "But more than anything, I feel grateful for the support I've received and for the chance to have this conversation. What happened to me isn't unique. Reporters face challenges like this all the time, often without anyone noticing. My hope is that we can use this moment to shine a light on those struggles and push for reforms that protect everyone's rights." The audience hung on her every word. She spoke passionately about the importance of a free press, emphasizing that journalists weren't adversaries of authority, but partners in ensuring transparency and accountability. She shared anecdotes from her own career, stories of moments when asking tough questions had made people uncomfortable, but ultimately led to meaningful change. By the end of the interview, viewers weren't just seeing her as a victim of circumstance, they were seeing her as a voice for something greater. Meanwhile, Judge Thomas prepared for his meeting with journalism leaders. He knew it wouldn't be easy. These were people who had spent years advocating for press freedoms, often clashing with institutions like the courts. Some might view him as the enemy, and he couldn't blame them. Still, he believed honest conversations could bridge divides. As he reviewed notes for the discussion, he thought about what he wanted to say, not as a judge, but as a person who cared about fairness and integrity. When the meeting began, the atmosphere was tense. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as representatives from various organizations took their seats around the table. Judge Thomas entered last, his presence immediately drawing silence. He sat down, folding his hands in front of him, and began speaking slowly and deliberately. "I know there's mistrust between us," he acknowledged, "and I understand why. What happened yesterday was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But I'm here because I want to learn, to listen, and to figure out how we can work together to prevent situations like this in the future." His honesty caught some off guard. One leader, a seasoned advocate for reporters' rights, nodded thoughtfully before responding. "It takes courage to admit fault," she said. "But actions matter more than words. We need concrete steps, clear guidelines that protect journalists while respecting the court's security needs." Others chimed in, sharing specific examples of times when reporters had been unfairly targeted or silenced. The conversation grew heated at times, but it never veered into hostility. Both sides seemed genuinely committed to finding common ground. By the end of the meeting, tentative agreements had been reached. Plans were set in motion to draft new protocols governing interactions between the press and the judiciary. While these changes wouldn't happen overnight, they marked a significant step forward, a recognition that collaboration, not conflict, was key to preserving democracy. As the day drew to a close, Karoline found herself reflecting on how far things had come in such a short time. Just 48 hours ago, she'd been an ordinary reporter going about her day. Now she was part of something much larger, a movement fueled by ordinary people demanding extraordinary change. Sitting alone in her apartment, she stared out the window, at the city skyline, thinking about what lay ahead. This was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for Karoline. She was everywhere, on television, in newspapers, on podcasts, and yet, she never let the attention go to her head. Instead, she used every platform she had to keep the conversation alive. Her message was simple but powerful. This wasn't about one person or one incident. It was about protecting the principles that held society together. Each time she spoke, she reminded people of why journalism mattered, not just as a profession, but as a cornerstone of democracy. One evening, after another long day of interviews and meetings, Karoline sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to slow down and breathe. She glanced at her phone, which lay face down on the table, its screen dark. It felt strange, not to have it buzzing constantly, but tonight she needed a break, a moment to step away from the chaos and reconnect with herself. As she sipped her tea, her mind wandered back to the beginning of all this. Just a week ago, she'd been an ordinary journalist doing ordinary work. Now she was being called brave, courageous, even inspiring. She didn't feel like any of those things. If anything, she felt vulnerable, exposed. But she also felt something else. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, her experience could spark real change. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, she set her mug down and walked over to answer it. Standing outside was an older woman she didn't recognize. She looked tired, with deep lines etched into her face, but her eyes were kind. "Hi," the woman said softly. "I'm sorry to bother you so late. I wanted to thank you." Karoline blinked, surprised. "Thank me? For what?" The woman hesitated, then explained. She was a retired teacher who had spent years trying to educate students about the importance of civic engagement and free speech. "When I saw what happened to you," she said, "it made me realize how much we still need to fight for these things. You reminded me that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's worth it." Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone to show up at her door, let alone someone who saw her as a source of inspiration. "That means a lot," she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly. "Really, it does." The woman smiled warmly before turning to leave. As Karoline closed the door behind her, she leaned against it for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. This was why she couldn't give up, not because she wanted fame or recognition, but because people like that woman depended on her to keep going. Across town, Judge Thomas was having his own quiet reckoning. He sat in his study, surrounded by shelves lined with legal texts and framed photographs of milestones in his career. Tonight, though, none of those accomplishments brought him comfort. His mind kept returning to the meeting he'd had with the journalism leaders. Their words had stayed with him, their frustration, their passion, their unwavering belief in the importance of a free press. He realized now more than ever how disconnected he'd become from the world outside the courtroom. He picked up a pen and began writing, not a formal statement or a legal opinion, but a letter. Addressing it simply to those who seek justice, he poured his thoughts onto the page. He wrote about his regrets, his hopes, and his commitment to doing better. He admitted that he didn't have all the answers, but he promised to listen, to truly listen, to those who challenged him. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. He wasn't sure where it would end up, but that didn't matter. Writing it had helped him clarify his own resolve. The next morning, the ripple effects of the incident continued to spread. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at strengthening protections for journalists, citing Karoline's case as evidence of the urgent need for reform. Legal experts debated the balance between judicial authority and individual rights, using the events as a springboard for broader discussions. Even late-night comedians weighed in, poking fun at the absurdity of the situation while underscoring its seriousness. For Karoline, the momentum was both exhilarating and exhausting. Every day brought new opportunities and new challenges. One afternoon, she received an invitation to speak at a prestigious university about freedom of the press. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her strong suit, and the thought of addressing hundreds of students intimidated her. But then she remembered the retired teacher who had knocked on her door. If she could inspire even one person in the audience to care about these issues, it would be worth it. When the day of the lecture arrived, Karoline stood backstage, nervously adjusting her blazer. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, filled with young faces eager to hear what she had to say. As she stepped onto the stage, the applause caught her off guard. She smiled shyly, waving before taking her place at the podium. For a moment, she simply stood there, soaking it all in. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'll admit I wasn't sure what to say today. How do you sum up something like this? But then, I realized it's not about me, it's about all of us. About the kind of world we want to live in and the role each of us plays in shaping it." She went on to share her story, weaving in lessons she'd learned along the way. She talked about resilience, courage, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. Students rushed to the front to ask questions, their enthusiasm infectious. Karoline left the event feeling energized, reminded once again of why she did what she did. Back at the courthouse, Judge Thomas watched clips of Karoline's speech online. He couldn't help but admire her poise and determination. Though their paths might never cross again, he knew they were connected now, bound by an experience that had changed them both forever. As he turned off his computer and headed home, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. The weeks that followed brought a mix of progress and challenges for both Karoline and Judge Thomas. For Karoline, life had become a balancing act. On one hand, she was grateful for the opportunities coming her way, speaking engagements, interviews, and even offers to write a book about her experience. On the other hand, the constant attention sometimes felt suffocating. There were days when she just wanted to disappear into the anonymity of her old routine, sipping coffee at her favorite cafe while jotting down notes for her next article. But she knew that wasn't an option anymore. She had stepped into a role bigger than herself, and stepping back now would feel like letting everyone down. One afternoon, as she walked through the bustling streets of Washington, D.C., Karoline noticed how people looked at her differently. Some smiled warmly, nodding in recognition. Others whispered to their companions, pointing discreetly in her direction. It was strange to be known, not for something monumental or heroic, but for standing her ground in a moment of unfairness. She tried not to let it get to her head, reminding herself daily that humility was key. Still, there were moments when the weight of expectation pressed down on her. That evening, she attended a panel discussion hosted by a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting press freedom. The event brought together journalists, activists, and legal experts to talk about the challenges facing modern journalism. Karoline was one of the featured speakers, seated alongside seasoned professionals who had spent decades fighting for the rights she now championed. As the moderator introduced her, she felt a flicker of nervousness. These were people who had been in the trenches long before her name made headlines. Did she really belong here? But as the conversation unfolded, Karoline found her rhythm. She spoke candidly about her experience, emphasizing that it wasn't just about her. It was about every journalist who faced obstacles while doing their job. "We're not asking for special treatment," she said firmly. "We're asking for fairness, for the ability to do our work without fear of retaliation or intimidation." Her words resonated with the audience, earning nods of agreement from the panelists and murmurs of approval from the crowd. After the event, a young woman approached Karoline, clutching a notebook tightly to her chest. "I want to be a journalist," she confessed shyly. "But I'm scared. What if something like what happened to you happens to me?" Karoline smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. "It's okay to be scared," she replied. "But don't let fear stop you. If anything, use it to fuel your passion. The world needs people like you, people willing to ask tough questions and hold power accountable." The encounter stayed with Karoline long after the event ended. It reminded her why this fight mattered, not just for those already in the field, but for the next generation of storytellers and truth seekers. Every word she spoke, every action she took, could inspire someone else to keep going. Meanwhile, Judge Thomas continued his efforts to rebuild trust. His letter, though private, had sparked something within him, a desire to engage more deeply with the community he served. He began attending public forums and town halls, places where ordinary citizens gathered to voice their concerns. At first, these appearances were met with skepticism. People weren't sure what to make of a Supreme Court justice showing up unannounced at local events. Was this genuine outreach, or just another attempt to polish his image? Judge Thomas understood their doubts. He didn't expect immediate forgiveness or acceptance. Instead, he focused on listening, really listening to what people had to say. At one forum, a middle-aged man stood up during the Q&A session, his tone sharp with frustration. "How can we trust you?" he demanded. "You've got all this power, but when it comes down to it, do you even understand what it's like for the rest of us?" The room fell silent, waiting for a response. Judge Thomas leaned forward slightly, meeting the man's gaze. "You're right," he said simply. "I don't know what it's like for everyone, and I won't pretend I do. But I'm here because I want to learn, because I believe we can't have justice without understanding." His honesty disarmed the crowd. While some remained critical, others nodded thoughtfully, appreciating his willingness to acknowledge his limitations. Over time, these interactions helped chip away at the walls of mistrust, fostering a sense of connection that hadn't existed before. Back at the courthouse, Judge Thomas implemented small but meaningful changes based on feedback from the journalism leaders he'd met. Security protocols were reviewed and adjusted to ensure they respected reporters' rights while maintaining safety. Training sessions were organized for court staff, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone fairly and professionally. These steps might seem minor compared to the grand scale of the justice system, but they signaled a shift, a recognition that even the smallest actions could have a ripple effect. As the months passed, the initial frenzy surrounding the incident began to fade. Headlines moved on to other stories, and social media chatter shifted to new topics. But the impact lingered. Lawmakers referenced Karoline's case when drafting legislation to protect journalists. Legal scholars cited the events as a turning point in discussions about authority and accountability. And for many ordinary people, the story became a reminder that change often starts with a single moment. One person standing up, speaking out, and refusing to stay silent. For Karoline, the journey wasn't easy. There were days when doubt crept, and when she wondered if she was making any real difference. But then she'd receive a message from someone saying her words had inspired them. Or she'd see a young journalist confidently asking tough questions at a press conference, and she'd remember why she kept going. This wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in the power of truth. And for Judge Thomas, the experience had reshaped his perspective in ways he never anticipated. He no longer saw himself as untouchable or above reproach. Instead, he viewed his role as one of service, not just to the law but to the people it was meant to protect. Though he still carried the weight of his mistake, it no longer defined him. Instead, it propelled him forward, urging him to be better, to do better. In the end, what started as a clash between two individuals had grown into something far greater, a testament to the resilience of humanity and the enduring hope for a fairer, more just world. Neither Karoline nor Judge Thomas could predict exactly where this path would lead, but they both knew one thing for certain. The lessons they'd learned would stay with them forever. Months had passed since that fateful day at the courthouse, but its echoes continued to reverberate in ways neither Karoline nor Judge Thomas could have predicted. Life had settled into a new rhythm for both of them, shaped by lessons learned and choices made in the aftermath of their encounter. What began as a moment of conflict had evolved into something transformative, not just for them personally, but for the broader conversations about justice, accountability, and human connection. For Karoline, the whirlwind of media appearances and speaking engagements eventually slowed down, giving her space to reflect on everything she'd been through. She returned to her roots, picking up assignments that allowed her to do what she loved most, telling stories that mattered. But now there was a difference in how she approached her work. She carried with her a deeper understanding of the weight her words held, not just in holding power accountable, but in inspiring others to believe in the possibility of change. 1. Crisp autumn morning, she found herself back at the courthouse, this time covering a hearing on press freedom reforms. It felt surreal to walk those same steps where everything had unfolded months earlier. The security guards recognized her and greeted her with polite nods, their demeanor warm and respectful. As she took her seat in the gallery, she noticed reporters around her chatting animatedly, sharing tips and exchanging notes. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air, a reminder that they were all part of something bigger than themselves. During a break in the proceedings, Karoline stepped outside to grab some fresh air. A group of interns from a nearby law school stood nearby, huddled together as they discussed the case being heard inside. One of them spotted her and nudged the others. "Isn't that?" he whispered, pointing discreetly. They approached hesitantly, clearly nervous about interrupting. "Hi," one of them finally said, his voice trembling slightly. "We just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. We're studying journalism and law, and hearing your story has really inspired us." Karoline smiled, touched by their sincerity. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "Just promise me one thing. Keep asking questions. Keep pushing for truth. That's how real change happens." The interns beamed, nodding enthusiastically, before heading back inside. Watching them go, Karoline felt a surge of hope. These were the future gatekeepers of justice and truth, the ones who would carry the torch long after she was gone. Knowing that her experience might have sparked even a small flame in their hearts gave her a profound sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Judge Thomas had also found a renewed sense of clarity in his role. His efforts to engage with the public hadn't stopped after those initial town halls. He continued attending community events, listening to concerns, and working behind the scenes to advocate for reforms within the judiciary. While some critics still questioned his motives, many began to see him not as an unapproachable figure of authority, but as someone willing to evolve and grow. At a legal conference later that year, Judge Thomas delivered a keynote address that surprised even his closest colleagues. Instead of focusing solely on legal doctrines or precedents, he spoke candidly about the importance of humility and leadership. "None of us are above making mistakes," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But what sets us apart is how we respond to them. Do we double down on our pride, or do we take responsibility and strive to do better? I chose the latter path, and it has taught me more than I ever imagined. His speech earned a standing ovation, not because it was polished or perfect, but because it came from a place of authenticity. For the first time in years, people saw him as human, someone capable of growth, reflection, and genuine care for the system he served. As winter approached, the nation seemed to shift subtly in response to the changes sparked by Karoline and Judge Thomas. New legislation protecting journalists' rights passed with bipartisan support, hailed as a victory for free speech advocates. Legal training programs began incorporating modules on empathy and communication, emphasizing the need for courts to remain accessible and fair to all citizens. Even social media played a role, with hashtags like Conquer Accountability for All trending during debates about transparency in government. Back in her apartment, Karoline flipped through the pages of her notebook, now filled with scribbles, sketches, and reflections from the past year. She paused at a quote she'd jotted down during a particularly tough day. Progress isn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's quiet and steady, like water carving a path through stone. Those words resonated deeply with her now. Change didn't happen overnight, but every step forward mattered. Judge Thomas, too, reflected on how far he'd come. Sitting in his study one evening, he pulled out the letter he'd written months ago, the one addressed to those who seek justice. He reread it silently, marveling at how much his perspective had shifted since then. Though he knew he would never fully erase the memory of that day, he no longer viewed it as a failure. Instead, he saw it as a turning point, a chance to become someone better, not just for himself, but for the institution he represented. In the end, their paths may never cross again, but the ripple effects of their brief encounter would linger, long after the headlines faded. For Karoline, it was a reminder that courage often comes disguised as fear, and that speaking up, even when it's hard, can ignite movements far greater than ourselves. For Judge Thomas, it was proof that admitting fault doesn't diminish strength, it amplifies it, creating opportunities for healing and growth. Together, they became symbols of resilience and redemption, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were human. And in their humanity lay the true power of their story. A testament to the idea that even in moments of conflict, there is always room for understanding, forgiveness, and hope.